All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So yesterday we actually covered the same ayat really, but talked about those ayat from a different angle. And we left off at this ayah. أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا قبلهم من قبلهم sorry من قبلهم من قرن مكناهم في الأرض ما لم نمكن لكم وأرسلنا السماء عليهم مدرارا وجعلنا الأنهار تجري من تحتهم فأهلكناهم بذنوبهم وأنشأنا من بعدهم قرنا آخرين. Okay, that was the ayah that we left off. We left at yesterday. Okay, so let's see. Yesterday we were talking about in general, just the general idea. I guess we kind of stayed and focused on the word يعدلون. So we got to one, looking at the pattern, looking at how we can extract and how we could see through these ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically informing us of the different creations, and the different creations would basically result in different energy, but the energy itself is not God, and cannot possibly and cannot be God, and not even in any possibility. And because matter itself was created by God Almighty, and then it basically takes us to also seeing the whole pattern that you yourself, well, not only are we talking about the spacious skies and all that you would see in the universe, but we're also talking about the small creature, which is you, and that everything was created, whether we're speaking about a dhulumat and the nur, we're talking about basically these forces. They would basically have an energy that terminates, that ends, that slows down, etc. So basically, it's not an eternal energy, but the Lord Almighty is the eternal one. So even for you, even you as a human being, you would recognize your energy is not forever, whether you go through death or whether we're speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala letting you know that your life is of a purpose that was sent through the prophets and the messengers. And of course, certainly there's a certain appointed time that whether you recognize the first time, which is death, or whether we're speaking about the other time, which basically is the hereafter or Yawm al-Qiyamah, etc. But in the end, basically letting us know that this is a very temporary moment. Okay. And of course, with all of that, well, what comes with that ajal, what comes with that recognition, or at least informing you of that purpose, what comes with all of this information, وَهُوَ اللَّهُ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَفِي الْأَرْضِ, that He's the Lord Almighty in the heavens and the earth. And we're speaking about if you're seeing the space, you're recognizing the time, and then you would recognize that you don't control not your space and not the time, and certainly not the energy and the forces that surround you, and even what you invest is basically in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's awareness, and therefore there's nowhere that and nowhere and no way that you can claim that you have the complete independence. If you don't have independence over your space, over your life, over your time, so you don't have space, you don't have independence, and you don't control your life because you've got a qada ajala wa ajala musamma. You don't control your space because He knows your privacy, and He knows the announcement that you would do, and certainly every single thing that you would contribute in, everything that you would do is basically in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, and certainly under His determination, then you would recognize that you are not the one that would control, you're not the one that controls what precedes you and what preceded your existence, and neither do you control what comes after your existence and where you head to after your death. So you don't control the before, and you certainly don't control what is after, and certainly even the space in this life, you recognize you don't control it because the provisions, your life, your health, etc., all of that is basically under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's determination, under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. I guess we also don't control the cough. Okay. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. And certainly, the ayah says وما تأتيهم. And for every single time, every single ayah that they had received, and they were given from the ayat from their Lord Almighty. Okay, so what is an ayah anyway? So that's what we want to get to with that Tafseer Qurtubi. What is that ayah? And what does that the word ayah refer to? Okay, so وَمَا تَأْتِيهِم مِّنْ آيَةٍ, and here Al-Qurtubi said, well, this is like the different examples, the different miracles, just like the splitting of the moon. And in general, he said the word وَمَا تَأْتِيهِم مِّنْ آيَةٍ, this is to basically get into that inclusivity. In other words, this is talking about any type of a miracle that they would get, whether we're speaking about the Quran or whether we're speaking about a physical miracle, something that they could say, whether we're speaking about a miracle that was done through the Prophet or by the Prophet himself, or whether it was a miracle that they would see around them. Perhaps they had made the dua that their son would get cured, and their son was cured, so that was a miracle right before their eyes, etc. So they had seen these miracles, so that would be considered this min ayatin, more of an inclusive ayah and not specific to one particular ayah, meaning it's not necessarily specific to one particular miracle. Okay, so what is al-i'rad? We talked about al-i'rad yesterday, and we said al-i'rad is one, it's basically when one sees the different signs, but then they basically don't make much of it. They don't come to the conclusion. They don't realize what these ayat contain. They don't see what those ayat contain. They don't see that what this complexity of creation is basically speaking of. It's giving you and letting you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, and that this complex creation can no way be in any possibility or in any even probability be the one to create itself. So that's letting us know that these basically the kuffar, or those that want to do al-i'rad, turning their backs and letting that blankness in their back, as if they cannot see it, as if they cannot hear it, as if they could not process it, as if they cannot relate to it, and that it's completely blank, and that's al-i'rad. Okay, فَقَدْ كَذَّبُوا. So is this ayah necessarily an inclusive ayah? إِلَّا كَانُوا عَنْهَا مُعْرِضِينَ, that they were basically turning away, they were dismissing any sign to being an evidence for the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what do we make of this? And that's why فَقَدْ كَذَّبُوا, some scholars said that this was in context referring to the disbelievers in Quraysh, but other scholars, they said it's not necessarily to refer to the disbelievers in Quraysh, but it was inclusive, that whether you're talking about during our time or perhaps in the future, you will basically get the same attitude from those that don't want to read the signs, from those that don't want to see the signs, and from those that want to just basically ignore and completely dismiss the signs. So what would they do? Mu'ridin. They just become mute. They just become deaf. They just become completely unaware and don't have any relationship with these signs, and they just move on with their focus, with their eyes, with their ears, with their hearing, with their mouth, or relationship with the world would only be their relationship with the world would only be based on based on basically uh, just their desires. So what happens? الإعراض. الإعراض is basically letting your gifts of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you in terms of potentials, that if it's used to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeing the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that's الإعراض. That's الإعراض. فقد كذبوا بالحق لما جاءهم. For they had denied الحق. What is الحق? Is الحق speaking about Al-Quran, or is it speaking about the Prophet ﷺ, or is it basically speaking about the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ, since it's basically both together? Definitely it's going to be talking about whether we're speaking about the message itself, or whether we're speaking about the Prophet ﷺ, or whether we're speaking about the prophets, or whether it's talking about the information that it basically is contained within the message. That's what they basically wanted to deny. فسوف يأتيهم. I want you to look at this word, فسوف يأتيهم. Now, فسوف يأتيهم, they will get the information, they will get the story, it will come to them, and all that they were mocking. What is that supposed to mean? So in Lugha Arabiya, when you say they're going to get it, this is not just giving you it's not just an informative clause. Okay. فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ is more of a threat. It's more of a threat. It's kind of like telling your son, if you don't clean your room, you're going to see what I'm going to do to you. Okay. What does that mean? It's basically threatening. She's not informing him that he's going to say what's going to happen, but she had basically made that that word contained some ambiguity, and it would sound scary. She didn't say, I'm gonna, spank you, or I'm gonna do this to you. You're gonna see what I'm gonna do to you. And that's even scarier because it lets you go into, I guess, your imagination of what's going to happen and what might happen and all of that. And you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ أَنْبَاءُ. Did he give details? Did he say what really is going to happen? He just said, you're going to say, and you're going to get that information, and you will see it right before your eyes, because it's going to be in relationship to all the mockery that you had basically given in response to the ayat. Okay, so فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ, so this is basically right there speaking about the punishment, and therefore, on the other hand, there is also an inference. Let's look at that. So when you say فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِيهِمْ أَنْبَاءُ مَا كَانُوا بِهِ يَسْتَهْزِئُونَ, so certainly if you look at that phrase, okay, you would say that there are two sides to it. One side, it's basically directed at the disbelievers, that there's a certain warning, there's a certain threat, okay? But from another angle, it also contains the support for the Prophet ﷺ, telling him that don't worry, all that you're going through in terms of the mockery, and the disbelievers are probably persecuted, you're persecuted, and all that you're going through, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to retaliate for you. Okay, so this sentence would go in two different ways. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will retaliate for you, and they'll get to see all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised that they'll be held accountable for and what they'll be held accountable for and what punishment they'll be getting. So, أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا Did they not see all the different, how many nations? I'm going to give that word by word translation, and then we're going to correct that translation. كم أهلكنا, how many were destructed of the nation from the nations, or at least the centuries before, the ones that we were given power, we were given basically different potentials on earth, which you are not given. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the skies pouring of water and the rivers basically flowing of water from underneath them, and we had destructed them with their sins. I'm going to use the wrong translation, with their sins, so we're going to get to why. وَأَنشَأْنَا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ قَرْنًا آخَرِينَ, and we had created after them centuries, many other centuries. The translation, I'm just giving you the wording of it, at least, the surface translation. Let's get farther in this ayah. When it says alam yaraw, this is talking about them seeing. Is this taking in, like going on some kind of tour? What does that actually involve? Okay, so number one, when you look at alam yaraw, this is basically letting them just recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had the same pattern. Not only is the pattern something that you could see in the universe, or basically in space, meaning the dimension space, and not the pattern that you would see in time as well, and not the pattern that you would see whether we're speaking about matter or whether we're speaking about your creation, but we're speaking about space, place, time, and we're speaking about everything being under the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting that right there for you to do the hands-on in seeing the pattern of how the nations before, how they had the power, which is basically what you as a human being would think, okay, I've got the power, I was created from clean, I've got the power, I've got the potentials, I've got the kasb, I've got the ability to get, I've got the ability to contribute, to make things, hey, all these different things you would be taking for granted. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, did you not see those nations for you to see the pattern? There's a pattern in creation, and there's also a pattern in relationship with the people, in how they reacted, how they dealt. Did they embrace the evidences that prove Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power? Did they take those evidences and signs to basically embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and embrace truth, or did they simply just dismiss it? What happened? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, there are many nations that they could see and scrutinize and study, basically to see from the nations that had passed before, that they were given tamkeen. I want to stop at this word. What is it, tamkeen? Okay, so here's the word, at-tamkeen. What is tamkeen? So the word makana, think of the word, machine, the machine in mechanic and all of that. So it actually comes from this root. I know it's kind of weird, right? It actually comes, mechanics and what it's all about. It's about control. Okay, what is a mechanic? What is mechanical engineering? It's all about studying how you can get control, basically using different laws of physics or studying different things or whatever it is. So that's that tamkeen, makana. It comes from this root. Okay, so when you look at makana, okay, in Lugha Arabiya, makana is basically to give you the authority to control something. Okay, And in Lugha Arabiya as well, when you say التمكين, it's in, every single addition is going to give you a new meaning. So when we say tamkeen, in other words, it was induced, and the power that you have is induced by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you might say it as matter in itself, and that you just learned how to manage it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, this matter, you would not have been capable of managing it, molding it, making it of use if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not given these laws basically the flexibility, or at least it doesn't have to be complete flexibility, but basically be something that you are capable of undermining, capable of studying, capable of making use, or probably capable of using different ways to make it under your ability to control, whether we're speaking about uranium, whether we're speaking about steel, we're speaking about gold, we're speaking about just different things that surround you, elements, chemistry, physics, etc. It's just that you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had certain laws that make this whole universe function. You manage to figure out some of those laws, not completely, but you managed to figure them out, and you managed to figure out at them that makana. You managed to figure out how things function. You managed to figure out the mechanism of how things function. Okay, is this plane landing over my head or what's happening? So here's what's happening on my end, everybody. The Chinese president is visiting Malaysia. Okay, so they're closing down all the streets, and I happen to be living in the place where it's all considered as government area. So yeah, we're going to be hearing the helicopters flying over us frequently. So yeah, all right. And they're not looking for me. They're trying to protect the Chinese president. Okay. So mekana, that mechanism, just like mechanism. Okay. So you recognize as a human being that you were capable of figuring out certain mechanisms of certain things, but that mechanism, when you figured it out, it became basically under your tamkeen. Okay. It became under your tamkeen, under your ability to basically control its mechanism. Mekana. You see it right there? So now you see that mekana. Okay. Mekkannahum, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So that whom right there is a pronoun talking about them. Okay, so mekkannahum, and that shadda right there. Okay, remember that one. So mekkannahum is that number one, that they were given the authority to control and figure out, and given the ability to figure out certain mechanisms in certain, basically, certain functions of how things work, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Makkannahum." So we allowed them to recognize the patterns, allowed them to recognize the mechanism and basically how things work, and therefore that gave them the power. So a couple things we would get from the tamkeen. Okay, from that makana. Number one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Makkannahum fil ard." Number one is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them the power on earth. So that's one. It didn't say makkannahum fis sama. There's a difference. Were they given power to control anything in space? The answer is no. It didn't say makkannahum fis sama. It said makkannahum fil ard. They're very localized in a specific area, and that area is basically limited in its space. Okay, That's number one. It's say مكنهم في السماء, مكنهم في الأرض. Okay. Number two, it said مكنهم, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one that gave them the ability. So is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving them the ability, or did they research it? Did they figure out how triangles work and how they could understand certain elements and certain chemistry and all of these things and biology and math and all of that stuff? Is that tamkeen? Was it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given to them? Every single science, every single knowledge, every single discovery is basically given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His will, that eureka, that basically the person finds, or it's basically by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay.
Can we say the gravity?
What was that?
Gravity
What
is
about it?
from Allah that gave him to make tamkeen in the
Well,
arm.
I mean, in terms of it, whether we're speaking about gravity, we're talking about density, all those different things there, even when we're speaking about gravity, it's not that they necessarily had seen gravity. It's that it was basically trying to understand, okay, Newton, why does this apple fall? And the legend and what it says. Okay, well, that means there's something pulling down. So that's when, okay, we're going to create the assumption that there is a law of gravity, and we're going to call it gravity, that's pulling everything. Okay, so whether we're speaking about gravity, whether we're speaking about electromagnetic fields, or whether we're speaking about the different laws that you would see in biology, nature, universe, etc., that all those Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You would only have just a very small amount of ilm to really understand everything about the world, and that's not necessarily everything. And certainly you can continue in your tamkeen, and that's that area, tamkeen. You could continue in research to understand how the mechana, how the function happens, and how the order basically is designed to figure out how things work and function. And that's telling us, I guess that whether we're studying engineering, because it's all talking about how the mechanism of things work, or whether it's talking about understanding the mechanism of basically the human body and how it functions, or understanding astrophysics, understanding physics, understanding even history. And that's another thing, is that there's a pattern even in history. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, there's a pattern in history, and I want you to recognize it. I want you to look into the archaeological facts. I want you to look at what these people were doing, and that they had pretty much a life like you have. They were concerned about their kids. They were concerned about making a living. They were concerned about protecting themselves from the different dangers, etc. They had a life like you did. And certainly the artifacts are telling you, whether we're speaking about the Aztecs, the Maya, the Pharaohs, the Babylons, the Greek, whatever it is, you would say that these people had recognized how things function, and they made it to use. But did they really make it to use for akhirah, or did they make it to use for dunya? It's another thing that we could read from the word makana. Every tamkeen that you're given, so the word is tamkeen, that would be the adjective. Okay, tamkeen, every power, every potential, that's what basically the translation of tamkeen would be. Every potential. Okay, but the root is coming from, well, how does a potential, what kind of a potential, and how does a potential actually come into basically something that you would see, or you would feel, or you would recognize? So that's basically with that tamkeen. So whether we're speaking about the tamkeen, one, recognizing the pattern of things, or whether we're speaking about التمكين to mean things, the pattern in physics, in engineering, in math, in biology, whatever it is, that's one side. And whether we're speaking about التمكين, your own personal one, okay? You recognized how business, what makes business, what makes a good business, what makes good marketing, what makes something that brings in more customers, whatever it is. So now you basically studied patterns in order to figure out التمكين, and that pattern that you were capable of researching is basically what gives you the potentials, gives you the keys to getting the potentials, but the potentials themselves are actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you might learn business and probably learn marketing and probably study the psychology of business. I don't know why they're a fan of psychology of business here, and study psychology of business, etc. But all of those are tools for التمكين, but the tamkeen is coming from مكنهم. It's actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Even the talents, their talents is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can we consider it like that?
It's a tamkeen, of course.
Tools,
It's a
yeah.
tamkeen. Of
Jazakallah
course,
khair.
you know, even if we're speaking about tamkeen, you know, even some people have the talent to act. Others might have the talent to probably sing, mimic voices. Others might have the ability to probably have, they recognize that their potential is in their body to probably work out or whatever. All right. So, or maybe others, they have the tamkeen to cook, but they do horribly in making sweets.
Same like you.
Same like me. I can cook really good food, but when it comes to sweets, oh man, never try my sweets. Never try my sweets. Okay. So when we're looking at التمكين, each and every single one is given a certain level of tamkeen and not all the tamkeen. Okay, and not all the tamkeen, not all the potentials. So they would have different areas of power, different areas of tamkeen, different areas of, let's call it intelligence as well, and abilities. So one might actually have it in maybe engineering brain, and the other one has probably the intelligence in literature. The other one might know, not in this and not in that. They're more in their body and they're capable of doing so much in their body. And others might actually have the hikmah. I want you to look at this one because al-hikmah is a form of tamkeen, okay? It's a form of tamkeen, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُؤْتَ الْحِكْمَةَ فَقَدْ أُوتِيَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Nothing is matching wisdom. Nothing matches wisdom in that tamkeen, or at least in recognizing how to see the pattern and use the pattern for a good cause. That's what hikmah is.
Is it the same hikmah that when we said that everything Allah doing it, subhanahu wa ta'ala, behind it there is hikmah. If we don't understand it,
Right, it's a good
there is
cause.
It is the same?
So basically, you know, when we're speaking about hikmah, we're talking about understanding how and having the intelligence to recognize the pattern. But al-hikmah, you know, you've got basically the wisdom to lead it and steer it towards a good cause.
Is
All
it
right?
why?
Is it why
the,
what?
is the answer of why is the because hikmah in our life?
Okay. Well, that's one angle. That's one angle. But you know, uh, that's one way of seeing it, you know, breaking it down. But in general, il-hikmah is basically to letting your intelligence recognize the patterns, and then you're steering that tamkeen basically, or you're steering all that information that you recognize in how the different mechanisms and the different things and how they function, and you steer it towards a good cause. So you recognize the mechanisms of things. You are so intelligent that you are capable of seeing social patterns. You're capable of reading through people's behaviors. You're reading through basically the choices. You're reading through the basically the situation that we're living in right now. And with your hikmah, you're maximizing the good. So what are you doing? You're probably taking the choices now, even though they're not necessarily let's say, the most beloved to you, but you would make the choices now, even though it might feel harmful, but that's because you recognize with your intelligence, because you had seen the pattern and where this is going. And because you could see that with your hikmah, you're trying to maximize the good outcome, whether we're speaking about relationship to your health, your social relations, whatever it is, and you would make the choices now based on looking through time, looking through space, looking through, basically whatever situation that you're living in. And in order to maximize the good, probably 10 years from now, 15, 20 years, 30 years from now, or maybe even farther. And that's a person that is of hikmah. It's maximizing the good, maximizing the benefit, basically. And even though many did not see it, they couldn't see that the choices that they're making right now and the implications of those choices in many years to come. Okay, so التمكين, at least within this context, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, كم أهلكنا من قبلهم من قرن مكناهم. I know there are certain ayat كم أهلكنا قبلهم من قرن. This is not another qira'ah, okay? But this is in this ayah من قبلهم. So this ayah is saying, well, from. This is the tab'id, okay? So you did say all the nations. You, as basically pagan Arab, you're just going to probably get the ability to see a localized group, but don't expect you to go all the way to probably the Americas and probably India and see the other nations in those countries. So we're speaking about maybe some of the nations that basically are within maybe your region, for you to see some of those nations, not all of them, because the examples are going to be plenty and plenty and plenty. And I'm very sure you won't be capable of probably unearthing a lot of those nations, but the ayah was saying min qablihim, some of those just nations that had come before you, and from those that basically min qarn. But I wanted to actually share this story. Okay, let's look at this one. So if we're talking about al-qarn, what is al-qarn? So al-qarn generally, okay, qarn can mean history, century, not history, but century. And al-qarn could also be taken from the root qarana. What is qarana? Qarana means to compare. Okay, in other words, you're comparing two things and all of that. So are we really comparing two things, or are we comparing centuries? Are we comparing cities? Are we comparing civilizations? What are we actually comparing here? Okay, but I liked what Al-Qurtubi, and he had actually pointed something that's quite interesting. So he said there is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, خير الناس قرني ثم الذين يلونهم ثم الذين يلونهم. He said the best of the word qarn, here it is again, and in basically in explanation explaining that qarn, he said what this would mean is that this is talking about the companions. ثم الذين يلونهم. Then the generation that comes after them, then the generation that comes after them. And he said, then what we're talking about in terms of qarn, he said, well, the Prophet ﷺ said, خير الناس قرني, to mean generation, basically. And what generation was that referring to? Well, that was referring that the best of the generation was basically the generation of the Sahaba. And then the generation that comes after them would basically be the generation that would come after them, would be better than the generation that would come even later. And what inference is that giving us? That certainly the generation that came before is better than this generation. So, in other words, your grandmother had a better understanding, a pure relationship than yourself. Generally, this is not speaking all the time. Okay, it's not always, because it can happen that a new generation might actually be better than the older generation. It can happen. Because certainly the young Sahaba, many of them were actually the ones that had believed and their fathers did not. Okay, just like Khalid ibn al-Walid. His father, Walid ibn al-Mughira, definitely he had the tamkeen, definitely he had the money, okay, and he had the different powers, but then certainly his own son Khalid, he was basically that generation of Sahaba, and he was certainly better than his fathers. And this isn't just in him, but we would see it even today. We can have somebody a believer, but then their mother is not doing, or their father is not doing the greatest in their faith. But in general, if we're talking about a Muslim community, for example, you would see that a lot of times the girls would be, and especially the younger generation, we're speaking about those that were influenced by the modern Gen Z, Western, influences, all of that. And they would mock the older generation that it was really nothing but backwards, nothing but too traditional, therefore too stupid. Okay. Now, one thing is that this hadith is giving us the inference that in general, the generations that had come before are actually better than the generations that would come later. They were pure, they were better in their commitment, they were better in tamkeen, they were better in a lot of different tamkeen, a lot of different powers. Definitely a lot more patient, perhaps even maybe sometimes even healthier, not necessarily always, but sometimes, and you could see that many times actually, yes, perhaps you might have thought that, yeah, I got a PhD or I got a master's or I got a bachelor's or whatever it is in, who knows, mechanical engineering, whatever it is. But then in life, you had you were book smart in terms of probably figuring out certain things about engineering, about medicine, whatever it is that you studied. But in terms of hikmah, you completely lost it. Because al-hikmah, to figure out those patterns, that actually comes with figuring out the tamkeen. In other words, figuring out how things function, whether we're speaking about social interactions, or whether we're speaking about understanding life and how to maximize the good by even controlling my drives. And we could see that we're living in an era where we had really lost a lot of that tamkeen, really lost a lot of it, because we're so focused on getting the materialistic things and not understanding the mechanism and not understanding with hikmah. Okay, so that's that's one interpretation, which is that generation. We're speaking about that generation and looking into this hadith, just letting you know that when your parents, if you know they're Muslim and they're practicing, etc., the chances are they have a better understanding in the religion, a better commitment in putting the religion into practice than myself and yourself. So reading through them, because it basically has less additions, that is basically Islam, etc. That's why we would say going through is Salaf as-Salih. That's why we would say reading through the interpretation, through the practice, through the experience, through the lens of the righteous predecessors. Why? Because they basically had lived it. They basically had been committed to it. And the Prophet ﷺ was saying, hey, the best of the nation, the best of the generations are basically the generation that is living amongst me, i.e. the Sahaba, then the Tabi'een, then the Tabi'een. And then, of course, the hadith continues. It doesn't end right there. The hadith continues to say, then people, and why is that so? It's because people would lose the commitment, would lose the honesty, would lose when you say honesty, why the emphasis on honesty? Well, the emphasis on honesty is because you're talking about that commitment to principle, regardless of the consequence. So we usually emphasize on the consequence because we had not learned, especially during our age, okay? We had not learned how to endure pain and how to endure all the different pains that we would get in order to get and maximize the good, which sometimes we may not live long enough to see. But to us, living the principle is what really matters, even if I don't live long enough to see it. But I would recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give me the reward on Judgment Day, even if I did not see the good in this life. I would know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give me the reward based on the effort that I had put in the hereafter. Okay, let's see. Some scholars actually said when this ayah was talking about أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ, did they not say the generations, the nations? They said, no, it's not talking about generations here. That min qarn, it's not talking about generations, but it's actually talking about centuries, time. To relate, in other words, referring to time and not necessarily a specific generation. Okay. Although it's not in total discrepancy, but let me see why they said that. Okay, so the other interpretation that this is referring to basically time, now we're talking about the chronology and, well, okay, what is the amount of time or how much time do I need to scrutinize or I need to research to, in other words, investigate in terms of understanding, in trying to see those nations and trying to see what is the time lapse that would give me the wisdom to recognize the pattern of a certain cycle for those that disbelieved in what happens to them, or for the ones that believed in what happens to them. So they're just like there's a pattern in physics, a pattern in chemistry, a pattern in all these different things that you would see. There's also a pattern in history. A pattern in history. So how much, like what is the amount of time in terms of pattern in history? Are we talking about 60 years? Are we talking about 70? Are we talking about 80? Are we talking about 100? Okay. What is the the time lapse that we're talking about? Majority actually said al-qarn is 100. What's the evidence? They said, well, there is a hadith. I want to look at this one. This is such a beautiful hadith. Okay, I'm going to take you to a different website. Okay, here we go. So I want you to look at this one. Okay, so there's actually a Sahabi. His name is Abdullah ibn Busr. Okay, Abdullah ibn Busr, his father, let's look at the story. Okay, this is how the story goes. Al-Hakim had narrated along with al-Bayhaqi, and the story is authentic, that Abdullah ibn Busr, he was basically a young boy. He said the Prophet ﷺ came to our house, to his father's house. And then his father grabbed like a pillow, and it was qalilatil khamal. The stuffing in it wasn't actually full. So it's like you got a pillow, but it wasn't really full, but it would dip. So the Prophet ﷺ, because the stuffing wasn't a lot within that pillow, so the Prophet ﷺ basically, you start, if the stuffing is not full or probably collapsed, basically you would just kind of grab it together and collect it together to kind of make it stronger. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ just combined it together, and then the Prophet ﷺ, well, actually, sorry, his father basically combined it together in order to make it something that is firmer, and the Prophet ﷺ just sat on it. And then his dad said to his mom, "Do you have anything to serve us?" Okay, who's doing the service? Why couldn't he get up and himself and just go do it, right, feminists? So you could see that the lady was doing a certain job, okay, and certainly she was working in the kitchen, and here it is. The father was telling his mother, well, no, his father was telling his mother, basically. Okay, in other words, the guy was telling his wife, "Do you have anything to serve us?" And she said, "Shay'un min hais." What is il-hais? Il-hais is basically dates. We would call it ajwa, but basically the dates, and they would take out the seed and basically kind of make it into a dough. Okay, that's il-hais. Okay. Kind of like what we would do for ma'moul and kakab ajwa and all of that. You would find it in the market. Okay. Then he basically served it and got it to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ would eat from it. Then, of course, da'a Rasulullah ﷺ, what did the Prophet ﷺ, well, I mean, his father invited the Prophet ﷺ to eat. Then the Prophet ﷺ looked at him. Looked at who? Abdullah ibn Busr. And the Prophet ﷺ looked at him, and Abdullah ibn Busr said, "And I was a young boy." What did the Prophet ﷺ do? The Prophet ﷺ just wiped over his head, okay? Like with a nice gesture. It's just a nice pad over his head, over the child's head. He was, just giving that personal connection with that boy. And then he said, quote, يعيش هذا الغلام قرنا. This boy will live a century. Qarnan is the word. Okay, let's see another one. Abdullah ibn Busr, he didn't know what a century was. So he said, "Oh, mom and dad, wa ummi, sorry." So then he basically, right there, he basically asked his dad, okay, we'll get there. So he said, قلت بأبي وأمي يا رسول الله وكم القرن قال 100 سنة. Said, "O Prophet of Allah, and how long is the century for?" And he said 100 years. Okay, there is another narration that Abdullah ibn Busr asked his mom, "How long is the century for?" And they told him 100 years. So was it the Prophet said, "I'm telling him 100 years," or was it that his father told him 100 years? So in the end, is that Abdullah ibn Busr said, "So I lived for 95 years And then I knew that 5 years were left, because the word of the Prophet ﷺ was going to basically be a prophecy that the Prophet ﷺ had foretold him that he's going to live for a qarn, for a century. So they basically started calculating, and they were like, he's got 5 years to live for, and he lived till 100 years. Okay. And certainly, this is just one side to just understanding, well, what is al-qarn? How do we understand al-qarn itself? Okay, so when we speak of al-qarn, so is studying history based on this and studying what tamkeen they had, whether we're speaking about military power, political, or whether we're speaking about perhaps the different powers that they were capable of building their civilizations, and that's tamkeen. In other words, understanding the physics, understanding the different architects, all those different things. Is that part of basically studying that? Is it part of seeing أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ? In other words, studying archaeology, for example, is that part of what we're supposed to be seeing? Or is this generally just letting the people of Quraysh and the other disbelievers see not only the evidence by looking at the matter and the motion and the energy that results from that, or looking into their own creation, or looking into whatever orbit and whatever is surrounding them, but he's also giving them another evidence by looking at another pattern, which basically is the pattern that people had existed before you. Then there's a specific pattern that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically judge and rule, and therefore you're not going to, one, get out of probably thinking that I can be an exception and move out of the laws that control the heavens and the earth and control basically your creation and what destiny you are destined to living into, and all those different orbits that basically control you, the potentials. You don't control the potentials, but you're given the keys to figuring out some potentials. And therefore, you would see how all these things would come together. That the nations before, they figured out some laws in relationship to astronomy, some laws in probably medicine, and that was all tamkeen. You recognize that the nations before, and there were nations before, that had seen and figured out that tamkeen, that mechanism of things, but that doesn't make them at all powerful enough to match or even think that they can maneuver all that mechanism that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. You're only given those tools of tamkeen, but that doesn't mean that you have the power to reverse that tamkeen or reverse the mechanism that this world is created in. And that's why he said, مَا لَمْ نُمَكِّنْ لَكُمْ. You don't even have their powers. That is the people of Quraysh. You don't even have the potentials. You don't even have the tamkeen. They had a stronger power that you thought that you had. And in fact, even the resources were a lot better than yours. The resources, whether we're speaking about rainwater from pouring from the top, or whether we're speaking about waters that are basically underground waters, and you could say that they had the resources. They had the tamkeen, they had the resources to connect the tamkeen, the intellect, the tamkeen, the power, etc., understanding the mechanism, and also the resources to build magnificent civilizations and far greater than your civilization, speaking to the people of Quraysh. But even that civilization, they cannot and they could not reverse the control and basically the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had determined in this life. فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. Eventually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, eventually, فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ. I want you to look at the letter fa right there, okay? Because the letter fa could mean that there was a time lapse, or could mean that that this is the reason. It's called fa sababiyya, the reason for that. And it could also mean that there was a time lapse. In other words, we're talking about a chronology of something. So which fa is that? Well, let's look at this one to understand what it is. So فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. They were destructed, and the word is بِذُنُوبِهِم. And I translated, I think I said بِذُنُوبِهِم when I did the translation. They were destructed by or through their sins. So how is it that they were destructed through their sins? Or is it not through? Is it that their sins, أهلكناهم بذنوبهم, for whatever sins that they had committed, that became their place of destruction? Is that it? So for example, some people might think, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. نَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. Someone might think that just by having the money, or by having the intelligence, or etc. Look at the time today. Look at our time today. We're seeing, are we getting the tamkeen that nations before us did not get? Yes, we sure are getting that tamkeen, but we are less healthy. We are basically even destructed in our societies. Our crime rate is going up. Where's the tamkeen? We definitely are doing great in terms of understanding science, but bidhunubihim. But certainly our hikmah had gone out, and the sins are basically at an increased rate. Then therefore, we could see that bidhunubihim, with the wrong intention, with the wrong action, with the wrong aim, with the sins, by not embracing the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what was supposed to be as tamkeen, it became basically what was going to be the place of destruction. So at one point, we were so happy that we figured out, for example, the food and what food, what minerals and what it contains and all of that. And then we started, let's use that not for maximizing the good, but maximizing perhaps the production in order to make more and more money. So what did we do? Well, we basically ruined our fruits, our produce, our food, our health, and it became bidhunubihim.
So بذنوبهم,
It
it gives the meaning of because of ذنوبهم?
Oh, absolutely. That's the first tafsir, certainly.
Yeah, what
Because
about
there's
the hikmah, the wisdom you said that about this بذنوبهم,
so
أهلكناهم.
right. So فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ, because of the sins that they had committed. That's, in other words, the principles that they did not use the tamkeen for. So they were given the tamkeen, but did they use it for the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, they didn't. So therefore, they were destructed. And through what? Through what they were given in terms of tamkeen. Okay, so that tamkeen was given to them, but they didn't use it for the right principle. So it became something that is a naqma. It became a niqma on them. It became something that was more of a harmful thing. It wasn't used for the good cause, and therefore أهلكناهم بذنوبهم, so they were destructed. So, for example, we're talking about the pharaohs. We're talking about, for example, all the different nations that
قارون.
Qarun, we're talking about all of them, and certainly whether it's whether it's a specific, a particular civilization, or whether it's different civilizations, that by turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what's going to affect the progress that it-tamkeen is taking place.
So if I want to understand the wisdom of what's going on here, it's in this way I understand anyone who would punish, there is a hikmah, or there is like wisdom, because why this happened to him, because that and that, right?
Absolutely. In other words, is the noob in sins, they're one reason, and they are a cause.
The fridge.
They are a cause, and they could be the reason why a lot of people might actually be going through, whether we're speaking about mental health, or whether we're speaking about increasing cancer rates, or probably high blood pressure, blah, 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 all those different things. It's basically bidhunub. Is it bidhunub, meaning the lifestyle that we are living in? It's all about using the tamkeen in the wrong way?
Oh,
Or
yeah,
is it using the tamkeen for the wrong cause? Okay,
right. Now,
right? So it's both. So
Jazakallah.
it's both.
Yeah,
Whether we're speaking about you're using the tamkeen for the wrong cause. Remember when we were talking about hikmah, whether you're using the tamkeen, the potentials for the wrong cause, or whether you're using it in the wrong way.
right.
Yes, this person, for example, I was listening to this podcast about narcissists, and it was saying that most narcissists are politicians, doctors. You would usually think these people are the most successful people, doctors. Why would a doctor be a narcissist? Basically wanted to use, his, let's say, tamkeen, he used it for the wrong reason. He probably wasn't a narcissist before, but his tamkeen, he had an ill intention, and that tamkeen basically had given him the power over people, and use it for the wrong cause. Use that tamkeen, whether it's using the tamkeen, whether it's using the knowledge or whatever power that potentials that they basically have, using it for the wrong cause, or whether it's basically not using the tamkeen, not using and basically misusing that tamkeen.
Yeah,
Just like
Jazakallah.
what we see today.
Zadakallahu ilman. MashaAllah.
It's subhanallah. I mean, when we're looking at فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ and seeing that tamkeen right there, you're connecting that مَكَّنَّاهُمْ أَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ, and that's why it's important to recognize that certainly the amount of effort that you would put, if you look at, for example, salah, it's basically standing longest the longer you stay is basically the better reward. And you're looking at fasting, you're putting in hunger, you're putting in an effort to probably give away some of your money. What are you doing? For zakah. Okay, what are you doing? That's supposed to be tamkeen. Like food is supposed to be tamkeen. I've got food that's supposed to be giving me power, energy, blah, blah, blah. And money that's supposed to be tamkeen. And certainly, why stay standing? It's not good for my legs. Why can't I just sit? It would feel better. But you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know. Okay, that doesn't sound so good. Sorry about that, everybody, but can you hear let's go somewhere else, okay? Can you hear all the snow blowing, or no, not snow, but the lawn mowing and the blower and all of that?
We don't hear anything.
You don't? Oh, girl.
Oh,
It's like, oh, that's why. He's right at my door. I'm like, why? Okay, go somewhere else. Is that? sounds like a snow blower, but it's actually, the blower for the leaves.
Mhm.
And someone else. Welcome to my bedroom.
We don't hear anything as if we have a headphone.
Oh, wow.
So
This one.
quiet in your area.
No, now it's quiet, to me at least. Okay, so when you're talking about فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ, so just keep that in mind. When you look at the effort that we would invest, whether we're giving up on some of our tamkeen, okay, look at that one. We're giving up on some of our tamkeen to get tamkeen. And this is important. We're giving up on money for zakah, but the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا نَقَصَ مَالٌ مِّن صَدَقَةٍ. How does that even work? How does it work that you are asking me to give donations, but then you're telling me it's not reduced, but it is reduced? The money did actually go down. I donated this amount of money, and now my bank account is less. Okay, but the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us that the tamkeen that you got, the tamkeen and the true tamkeen, is not in the money and what people would study in materialism. But the true tamkeen is basically in the tamkeen that you would grow in going away from dhunub. You see that? That the true tamkeen is when you go away from sin. You see that? Because it said فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. So you would see that tamkeen they thought was tamkeen was actually sin. So the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us that what truly makes tamkeen is when you would have the principle in place. Remember when we talked about al-hikmah and how that basically takes you into determining basically the aftermath, the result of things, etc. That's basically that tamkeen right there is part of the tamkeen. Same thing. So true tamkeen is when you basically have the value, the principles, the commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore, just as these people were given the potential, but they used it for the wrong thing, and therefore it became a niqmah on them, it became nothing but just a burden. And that's why it said فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ. And you want to keep in mind, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. That some evil and some good, some good, you've got money, but then this money, it was appearing that, oh, this person is so lucky to have that money. But then this money became what occupied them away from their family, what occupied them away from their health, what occupied them away from basically a lot of things that they were supposed to be doing. It became what distracted them away from value and what really mattered. Okay, so when you're looking at فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ بِذُنُوبِهِمْ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that the true tamkeen is not in what they would say as the tamkeen, but the true tamkeen is basically when we are not destructive. Let's reverse this one. Now we're not going to say فَأَهْلَكْنَاهُمْ, we're going to reverse it. Okay, رفعنا درجاتهم. رفعنا درجاتهم with what? If it's رفعنا درجاتهم, if we're flipping this one, that means we're gonna flip this one too. رفعنا درجاتهم بالعمل الصالح. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, والعمل الصالح يرفع. العمل الصالح is what elevates man. What elevates you is basically العمل الصالح. So we're not reversing the ayah, we're reading the ayah through another ayah. والعمل الصالح يرفع. وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. And الآخرة is better and long lasting. Why? Because all that tamkeen that you're getting, it's basically called the laws of thermodynamics, and basically here you go, it's all gonna go. Okay? And when you're looking at وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ وَالْآخِرَةُ, and آخرة is خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ, and therefore الرُّفْعَ, or to basically get elevated, to basically get the true tamkeen, is basically by living the principles and the values of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَنْشَأْنَا مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ قَرْنًا آخَرِينَ, and we had created after them centuries or other centuries. And which centuries? Like other good centuries? Is that what it's talking about? Certainly. Other centuries. So let's see Al-Qurtubi. مكناهم في الأرض ما لم نمكن لكم. And he said خروج من الغيبة إلى الخطاب. So when, that was right there before. It was basically speaking to a direct, well, actually, وهو الله. That was al-ghaiba in basically talking about that the method that was used in these ayat, فقد كذبوا, it's no, where is it? وما تأتيهم من آية. Okay, up to here, up to this ayah, you could see that the part of speech, let's look into it. The part of speech was one, it was basically like a third person. Alhamdulillah, khalaqa, it was talking not directly to the person. But then when it got here, it redirected the part of speech. In English, you can't do that. But in Lugha Arabiya, this is considered eloquence, balagha. Okay? To change the part of speech. So what does that look like? In a sentence, you know that I had that problem in English writing always, that I could easily shift. I would always shift between the parts of speech when I'm talking like a third person, and then I would talk as a first person. So that was always the problem, because in Lugha Arabiya you could do that. In Lugha Arabiya you could shift from a first person to a third person and second person, etc. So that's basically what it was talking about, referring to here, that أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ مِنْ قَرْنٍ. It did not say, no, now it's talking to them, talking about them as, well, like he's not even talking directly to them. He's talking about them now. He's not even directly talking to them, because why? Because he's not directly talking at them and to them anymore. Well, because anyways, they're mu'radin. They're turning their backs anyways. So now the part of speech is not going to be directed at them, because they're not even wanting to listen. So now it's for you and I to learn, those that want to hear the lesson. See that there are lessons to learn by looking at the patterns, whether in space or in place, etc., or whether we're speaking about seeing the patterns in time, civilizations, and so forth. Okay, so what were they given? Well, they were given just different tamkeen in this life. That tamkeen, understanding the different mechanisms, and definitely the resources, when it talked about أرسلنا السماء عليهم مدرارا, to basically refer to the different resources, whether it was coming from up above them, the rainwater, or from the bottom. I must admit, I didn't really know that tamkeen and the relationship between tamkeen and rain and water, except when I came to Malaysia. Such a fertile country and such a beautiful green country. Just seeing the greenery itself is mesmerizing, and everywhere. And yesterday pretty much rained the whole day, and the amount of water is what keeps everything so green. Believe it or not, the tree trunks are even green. I never saw that except rarely. I would see it, I used to see it in sometimes in Minnesota during probably the spring that things are really green. Okay. But here you would see the whole tree trunk, the branch itself is green.
Yeah,
You know,
same like Indonesia.
yeah, it's
Mhm.
green. You're like that's the amount of water. It's so I was actually wondering like, can we grow olives here? And it was no, you cannot, simply because it's too humid and it basically gets a lot of rainwater that would make the olive trees, their roots rotten, so you can't really grow those kind of plants here. But you would say watermelon. You get to eat watermelon in Malaysia throughout the year. You've got good water, tasty watermelon.
Coconut,
And man,
coconut.
coconut. Oh, that coconuts, you would
The
walk down the
monkeys
street and you're
or the
seeing coconuts
monkeys
everywhere.
climate.
You're walking down the street and the coconuts are thrown everywhere. And yeah, so that one, don't even mention it. All right. Okay, فأهلكناهم بذنوب أي بكفرهم. Some scholars actually said بذنوبهم. So whether we're speaking about al-kufr or whether we're speaking about sins, okay, in the end, it's a type of kufr. Okay, so but whether we're speaking about as a sin to mean basically going off the pattern, the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's one type of kufr or one type of dhanb, or whether we're speaking about idhnub to go off the principle. And basically, right there, this ayah is saying, well, bidhunubihim, the reason for the destruction is basically سبب الانتقال وزوال النعم. The reason why they lost the tamkeen, why they lost their health, their mental health, their security, their happiness, all of that. They lost all of that simply because they're engaged in sin. They're not using those potentials for the right cause. Therefore, you cannot cut corners. It's coming at them. It will snap at you if you don't use it or you don't use that tamkeen for the right cause. It will snap in your face. It will basically come to harm you. And it's basically the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in this world. You use it the wrong way, it's gonna snap at you. That's not how it was created to function in. You use it in the wrong way, it will come and slap you, tell you, you can't do it that way. Just because it might actually appear that it fits in that area, it doesn't make it that that's where it belongs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has his laws, and therefore you have to base it on that. You have to base it on the principles, the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe in, and don't think you could cut corners, because the second you cut corners, you're doing a dhanb, you're doing a sin. And that's basically to also let us know that sin is not only in relationship to what we eat or how we relate with people, because that's one side of sin, but sin can be also in harming things in tamkeen. You're probably, maybe, harming animals, maybe harming the nature. That was supposed to be given to you for tamkeen, but if you're using it in the wrong way, well, then you're not putting your tamkeen in place. Then that's a them. So whether you're changing the ecological system or probably in your body, you're feeding yourself the wrong foods or probably different amounts, the wrong amounts, or wherever it is, or probably the social system, and you think that you could force a social system to be in a certain way. There's no way. The system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, whether in a samawat or in al-ard, or whether it's in human beings, or whether it's in the nature and social relations, etc. Those are patterns, paradigms. Those are basically created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By changing it, you're basically changing and thinking that you could reverse that tamkeen or that you could reverse that law, you got it completely wrong. You would have to live based on those laws, and that's the tamkeen and not against them.
extremely عقيدة. سبحان الله.
Absolutely. This is aqidah. This is aqidah.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do, if anybody has any questions before we kind of just, you know, give you a couple minute break and then we'll go for Hisn al-Muslim. Okay, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I have a question, inshallah.
Go ahead, dear.
Yeah, for مكناهم, can we say as عقيدة that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the doer, الفعال?
I personally like when it comes to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and attributes, I personally like sticking to the names and the names and attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to himself. Because once we go into using a different verb in a different word, then we get into different areas that can be interpreted in different ways, and then putting us into some form of what is actually called يلحدون في أسمائه. I
Oops.
don't want to do that ilhad. What is ilhad? Ilhad is not atheism. Ilhad is to reinterpret. Okay, so يلحدون في أسمائه, they would reinterpret the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to make it seem as something that is at least more rational or probably make it seem something that is rather closer to their understanding, etc. But I would say when it comes to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, stick to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had used in terms of terminologies or words or descriptions, because the second you go off those, let's call it off that orbit, you're going to find yourself either going into Mu'tazili, or you're going to find yourself Mu'attila, Mujassima, and you're going to find yourself going into all of those categories. So let's not label those. Let's not get right. I'll just make the story short and just say, stick to the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, stick to that description, try to avoid all the other fancy interpretations, because you're going to find yourself going into a different world.
Yeah, but فعال لما يريد. The root
Right.
of فعال.
Right. Yes, I know he's فعال لما يريد. But can I use that as a noun, as a name? Sorry.
Attribution, you mean?
Right. Can I say he is al-fa'al?
الفعال.
You see what I mean? You see what I'm saying? We said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فعال لما يريد.
Like الشافي,
Can
الرشيد.
I say he is al-fa'al? That's that's why I don't like going into that area. It's like,
Yeah,
because
but
it said فعال لما يريد, but can I put an al right there and extract from that and say, okay, here's a name for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is al-fa'al. It wasn't part of the 99 names. Just stick to
it's
what,
only, it's not only 99 names, more than that.
right, but there's a whole debate on that. So I'll just in brief and in summary, in short, I will just say, it's okay, فعال لما يريد. I'll stick to that wording, but I would not say he's al-fa'al. And I would stick to the majority of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and I like to stick to that.
Okay, another thing for the wisdom, in Surah Sad, ayah 88, and when he said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَتَعْلَمُنَّ نَبَأَهُ بَعْدَ حِينٍ. Is it the wisdom? You will know
ولا تعلمون نبأه بعد حين I believe is in سورة فصلت, not
No,
الصف. Am I right?
I catch it from Google صاد
Okay.
88, but because of the ولا تعلمون نبأه بعد حين, I want to focus on the hikmah. Is it it means that you know the wisdom from it,
No, النبأ is not
Quran,
wisdom. النبأ is الخبر, is the information,
or
not the wisdom.
it's true, it's reality. This means
Yes,
about the
absolutely.
Quran.
So
Or
absolutely,
the,
that you'll get to the point
yeah.
that things will become clear to you, that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had informed you about, that it's the truth. You wanted to, or they wanted to, argue about it, somehow reject and somehow object and somehow just wanted to just not believe in it because it was requiring a big commitment. To believe in it actually means it's going to require a lot of commitment, a lot of trade-offs, a lot of things that I have to give up on. That's what it means. If I were to believe in this, that actually means I have to put a lot of effort to be committed to what this is saying. So when you see وَلَتَعْلَمُنَّ نَبَأَهُ بَعْدَ حِينٍ, you'll see that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had foretold you about where this is coming to and where this is taking you and where this life is created for and where your life and where your ending is coming to, you're going to really know those patterns and you're going to see it's gonna be so obvious to you, and you will see in there there's no denial. You don't want to believe in it now, but you're going to come to that realization
Yeah.
one day. You don't want to believe in it now, but you're going to see it right before your eyes and regret denying it before.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's
because you spoke about the Quran or about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right?
absolutely.
Right, right. Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So what we're gonna do like a 2-minute window break, okay? And let me pause the recording right there. How do you do this? Okay. You know, you do it so many times and then you all of a sudden just